Thanks for watching CMTV. We know you'll be blessed by this week's message. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Visit cmjacksboro.com for more information about our church and ways you can get involved. Thanks for joining us and welcome home.
We're at Memorial Day weekend, and if you saw the Jacksboro news this week, you know that tomorrow something big happens. We've got the dedication set for the military memorial tomorrow. If you haven't been down to see it, most of you have, because it's been so much the product of what people in this church have done. Really, really cool stuff. There's 3,142 counties in the United States. I haven't been in all of them, but I've been in a whole bunch of them. And this is the best war memorial I've seen in any county. It just is absolutely phenomenal what's happened here. And so tomorrow it starts at 6:45. That's a little unusual time. By the way, Governor Abbott couldn't be here, but he did send a proclamation for what's happening tomorrow. Really cool proclamation from Governor Abbott. But it starts at 6:45 tomorrow, and that's an unusual time. That's because we want to be in place, because part of tomorrow involves World War II flyover. We've got planes coming that will fly over, missing man formation as well. For those, these were planes that were used in World War II. They were also used in Korea and Vietnam. So Memorial Day, big day tomorrow. I encourage you all to be there. Bring everybody you can. It's going to be a big deal. I think it's a big deal spiritually what happens as well. Let me give you a little history, if I can, on Memorial Day. Memorial Day really kind of has its genesis and origins in what happened in the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, when the South surrendered, you have the Appomattox Courthouse surrender, there had been, the loss of life was so high. I mean, what happened in loss of life in the Civil War was just amazing. And so 3 years after the end of the Civil War, General John Logan, who was the commander of all military forces in the United States at that point, the reunified United States, he issued General Order 11. And General Order 11 said that in May, actually I'll just read it to you. Here's what he said. The 30th of May, 1868 is designated for the purpose of strewing with flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in defense of their country during the late rebellion and whose bodies now lie in almost every city, village, and hamlet and churchyard in the land. And that really was literally true. With America's population at that time and 620,000 having been lost, virtually everybody had someone in their family who was killed in that conflict. And so he called on the 30th of May to be set aside for that. And so at Arlington Cemetery is where they had the national observance. On that day, General James A. Garfield, who had been a general in the Union War, actually he became the 20th President of the United States. He was a minister of the gospel before he became a president, was part of the Second Great Awakening, he became a political leader and a military leader as well. He gave the address on that day. And then women there from Washington, D.C. went throughout the cemetery decorating the graves of both Union and Confederate. And so that's what started what became known as Decoration Day. We decorate the graves of those who have fallen in the Civil War. Well, when you get through World War I, there were so many loss. And by the way, by the time you get to 1890, this was a holiday celebrated by a lot of states, but not all. The southern states wouldn't celebrate Decoration Day because they weren't going to put flowers on the graves of Union guys, even though the Union was putting flowers on the graves of Union and Confederate guys. So it became largely a northern observed holiday. The South still decorated the graves of fallen Confederate guys, just not fallen Union guys. And so by the time you get to the end of World War I, there were so many lives lost at the end of World War I that what they decided to do was, let's just say the Decoration Day is for all of those who have ever died in a war at all. And so at that point in time, it became known as Memorial Day. So there in 1918 is when that occurred. Now, it was different days throughout the years, and so what happened was in 1968, the Uniform Holidays Act was passed. It was signed by President Lyndon Johnson, and it said, all right, the last day of May, or the last Monday of May, will be Memorial Day. And so that's when it got set up with 68. It went into effect in 71 under President Richard Nixon, and so that's where we are today to have Memorial Day. So that's how Memorial Day comes about. The purpose of Memorial Day is kind of misunderstood in a lot of circles, so let me kind of take you through it. Memorial Day deals with those who have died in battle, and there is a real push against the military in the United States. A lot of folks That's all death. We want the coalition for peace. You get all these protest marches, especially when our guys are involved in conflict somewhere. And I love reading the signs in this. For example, you see the sign there at the back. It says, God is love, as if that's going to change the outcome and never have another war. I like the one in front, read the Bible. And I think it's ironic because I don't think they've read the Bible. I don't think they have a clue what's in the Bible. Because if you read the Bible, you get passages like Isaiah 13:3, where God says, I have commanded my holy ones. I've summoned my warriors. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. That's biblical. That's what God himself says. It's like if you read the Bible, you'll never have war again. That's not the way that this works. As long as there is evil in the world, there will be war, because evil will always try to conquer and oppress the righteous, the good guys, and there's got to be war to make sure that freedoms are preserved. So people that live in utopia land think we can all get along, that if we all sit down and talk about it, we can get ISIS to put down all they're doing. They just need to understand. It's not going to work. You've always had light and darkness, and those two things do not mix. The Bible makes it really clear. That's why you have military and armies. You also have 1 Chronicles 5:22. It says, for there fell down many slain because the war was of God. And that's got to screw up the theology of those on the other side, that war would actually be of God. But there are times that it is, because God wants His freedom preserved. He wants goodness preserved. Now, people say, well, that's all the Old Testament. Okay, let's jump to the New Testament. Matter of fact, let's jump forward in the future to Revelation. I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was faithful and true, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. And that's after Jesus comes back. So this thing about war is not something that you're going to suddenly go away. It's part of what has always been. It's part of something that God has ordained. It's just part of it. And it's interesting to me how many of the greatest miracles and displays of God's power in the Bible revolve around times of war. Exodus 14, everything that happened with the 10 plagues, everything that happened with the Red Sea was to destroy the armies of the Pharaoh, destroy the Egyptian army. That's where the final decimation occurred, was there in Exodus 14. What a great miracle. Unprecedented miracle. Never before been done. Hasn't been done since then. It was done to destroy an army. You have what happens in Exodus 17 when they're fighting the Amalekites. And as long as Aaron and Hur hold up Moses' arm, they win. When he gets tired and his arms start coming down, they lose. So God's got this thing where as long as you keep Moses' arm in the air, you're going to win the battle. And so that's why they held it up until they finally won the battle, destroying the Amalekites. You have what occurs in Joshua 6. No need to explain what happened in that. The walls came tumbling down. It wasn't anything any army did. It was something God did. Eugene, Sadie, the rest of us, we've been over and seen those fallen walls of Jericho. Pretty amazing stuff to see what God himself did to destroy to help destroy that enemy. As you move into Joshua 10, this is where they're fighting the Amorites. And Joshua says, I've got them on the run, but sun's going to go down and they're going to be able to regroup at nighttime. That's not going to be good. And so he prays, and the Lord holds the earth still. The earth no longer rotates. And for a period of 24 extra hours, they had sun. So it's like a 36-hour day, which God did that so he could destroy the Amorites. Performed that miracle unlike any other miracle in the history of the world, holds the universe still so the sun shines an extra 24 hours, and they get that time to be able to destroy the Amorites. We're introduced in Genesis 11 to Abraham. Abraham, we find out, as a man who loves God. God calls him. He makes his covenant with Abraham, and then the enemy comes and goes into Abram's household and takes all of his family, all those who are part of his household. And so he goes out and pursues them. That's when Lot is taken. And so he goes out and pursues them, destroys the kings. He comes back, and that's when he has the meeting with Melchizedek. Melchizedek is seen to be, many believe it was actually Jesus appearing in the Old Testament, but it certainly is the typography for Jesus as the high priest. And so what happens was, Abraham goes to Melchizedek and gives him a tithe. This is where the tithe got started. Was Abraham himself, before the law was ever given by God. There is no law of Moses. Abraham himself says, here, 10% of everything I've just taken from the enemy, it's yours. But it's interesting, the tithe got started by giving 10% of the spoils of war. What he had done was taken his household back, got Lot rescued, destroyed the kings, and he gives a tithe of that. So the tithe actually goes to an act of war, if you will. That's where the tithe gets started. If you go to 1 Samuel 17, we know what happens with David and Goliath and many other things throughout David's life. David's life is filled with God's miraculous interventions, all in favor of war. So when you get to Hebrews, there's so many of these. You get to Hebrews 11, which we call our Faith Hall of Fame. That's all the heroes of the Christian faith. I love the way that passage closes. A couple of verses at the end. Hebrews 11, 32 and 33 says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and also of David and Samuel, who through faith subdued kingdoms, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the enemies." So these heroes that God holds up to us, military, 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 and I got a whole lot more I could tell you, who became valiant in battle, subdued kingdoms, that's the heroes that God holds up to us. So the notion that military is a bad deal, and now military can be a bad deal, just like government can be a bad deal, just like church can be a bad deal. I mean, church is right now a bad deal in many areas. We saw this past week a prominent pastor with a church of 10,000 who's always been seen as a really key guy, saying the notion that God would send anybody to hell, that's heresy. No, you saying that is heresy. The Bible is real clear that there is a heaven and a hell, and the church right now is leading many people astray in a bigger sense because it's not biblical anymore. We know that right now among born-again Christians, you have 46% of born-again Christians who think that Jesus sinned while he was on earth. I got news for you. If Jesus sinned while he was on earth, you can't be saved. The only way you get to heaven is because he was sinless, committed no sin, was sacrificed for our sins. It was a sinless lamb, the Lamb of God sacrificed. That's the only way we get to heaven. By the way, 70% of born-again Christians think that you can get to heaven some way other than through Jesus Christ. If you have sincere beliefs, Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but by me." So we actually have the church really goofed up in a lot of areas right now because it's just not familiar with God's Word and doesn't believe God's Word and doesn't follow God's Word. But when you do, the military is a very prominent part of what happens throughout the Bible. So we used to have sermons on it. This is a deployment sermon from the French and Indian War. The Constituents of a Good Soldier, sermon preached by the Reverend Samuel Davies, one of the greatest pulpit preachers in American history. Here's a sermon preached in the late 1800s by Pastor M.I. Mott. Again, the Christian patriot, military sermon. Here's a sermon that was part of nearly a 200-year series of sermons. The Ancient Honorable Artillery Company in Boston. This is kind of like their equivalent of the Texas Guard. This is their state militia, their state guard, and every year they elected officers, and they had a sermon every year at the election of officers to the military. So it's like the state guard has a sermon every year. That's what they were called, artillery sermons, literally. And so that was a very common feature as well. So at a time when we were a lot more biblical, we understood how important the military was. So these guys, that's part of who we honor today on Memorial Day. But I love the fact that God makes really clear He's put a special blessing on soldiers. Psalm 144:1, God says, "Praise be to the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle." Now we know that God gifts people with a lot of different gifts. I mean, we're watching NBA playoffs. There's some guys there with amazing skill sets. God has gifted them with a way that it's just amazing. But we watch the same thing with artists who paint. We watch the same thing with orators who speak. We watch so many things where God's gifted them. God's gifted a certain set of individuals. He trains their hands for war, their fingers for battle. They're really good at what they do. And the rest of us benefit of the fact that that is a gifting of God. So just as being a pastor or being a teacher or being a physician or a surgeon, that can be a gifting of God, so too with the military. And that's the view we had for so long in America. So going to Memorial Day, see if I can put it in perspective. What happens is we've had 43 million Americans serve in the military since back at the time of George Washington. 43 million Americans have put on a uniform and said, "I'm willing to stand whatever it takes, defend the rights and liberties of my country and my citizens, fellow citizens." Of that, there's 18 million that are still alive today. So we have 18 million veterans that are alive today. But out of all of that 43 million, 1.2 million have died in service. So Veterans Day, we celebrate the 43 million, but on Memorial Day, we commemorate the 1.2 million. We don't celebrate that. We honor them, we recognize them. That's why Memorial Day is different from Veterans Day. They're both military holidays, but one is for those who served, and one is for those who gave the ultimate, gave the John 15:13, no greater love hath a man than he lays down his life for his friend. 43 million were willing to lay down their lives. 1.2 million actually were called on to do so. So in doing that and looking back who we are and what we are, I thought it'd be kind of interesting to go back and just kind of reacquaint ourselves with how much has been paid up to this point to preserve what we often take for granted today. We're in a nation that's had stability for so long, we just take it for granted. We've had a Constitution for 230 years. I'll point out the average length of the Constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. 230 years, we've never thought about changing anything after 17 years in the way of constitutional forms of government. We just assume this is natural to have a stable government. It's not. Nobody else in the world comes close to a stable government. Same with our military. We just assume that we got a military, it's a great military, they'll do the right thing. Not so. All over the world, you've got militaries that don't do the right thing. They go in the wrong direction. We've been very blessed to have leaders and have a nation that understands the biblical role of the military. And so we've always been blessed for that reason. But looking at it, let's just start with, for example, the American Revolution. I'm going to go through most of our major wars real quickly and show you what the cost was so that we enjoy what we have today. And by the way, I'll point out that even here in Texas, now in Texas I've been appointed multiple times by the State Board of Education to help do the history and social studies standards here in the state. Matter of fact, this last week I was contacted by the State Board of Education again to come to Austin, help them with things that they're working on right now with the standards for the state. It was amazing to me that 8 years ago in 2010, when we were doing the standards for Texas, which is the standards we use right now, this starts with 270 classroom teachers, and they go through and write the standards for all the kids for K-5 all the way through high school senior. And then the State Board of Education has 6 experts that they brought in. I was one of the 6, and we looked at the standards the teachers had written. And it was amazing to me that what the teachers did was they removed all military history. They took out the origin of all 5 branches. They took out the major battles. And past that, that's a national trend that's going now, is we don't care about military history. We don't know about it. When you look, for example, at the AP history standards that are in use right now, I didn't write those, didn't have input on that. It was done by the College Board. They're the ones who write the tests for 47 different AP classes. If you look at AP history standards right now, there's no battle in the American Revolution, no battle in the Civil War, there's no military leaders in the American Revolution, there's no military leaders in the Civil War. As a matter of fact, in World War II, there was no Battle of the Bulge, there was no D-Day, there was no Iwo Jima, there is no Patton, there is no MacArthur, there's none of those guys. So Eisenhower, they're all gone. And so in the current AP U.S. history standards, we know nothing about military history in America. We don't know about our wars. We don't know about the costs. We're just here, and isn't it nice we're all here today? Well, we're here because of things that happened before in history. So when you look at the American Revolution, that was actually an 8-year period of time where the average citizens just rose up and said, we're going to defend our liberties. That's what birthed the military. The citizen side of the military was just citizens saying, we're going to get the squirrel guns down off the fireplace. We'll go out and fight against whoever wants to take away our freedoms. And so in that period of time, you had 18,000 prisoners of war. Prisoners of war back then, as it has always been with a lot of wars, very barbaric. We actually lost many more. We had many more military deaths result from prisoner of war camps of the British than we did from British bullets. A matter of fact, nearly 3/4 of the casualties in the American Revolution came from people who died in prisoner of war camps. You have those who were wounded in battle, and notice that there's about 6,000 wounded, but there's about 25,000 who died. So notice 4 times as many deaths as there are those who are wounded. We're going to talk about that as we go through. But that's the American Revolution. So considering the very tiny population of America back then, that's a lot of people who gave their life so that we could even have the nation that we get to enjoy today. The next major fight we had was the Barbary Powers War against Muslim terrorists. This war lasted for 32 years. The conflict went from 1784 to 1816. It actually continued some after that, but at least we had a peace treaty by 1816. The conflict occurred under 4 different presidents. So 4 different presidents were wartime presidents right in a row. That's how long the conflict lasted. We don't think in terms of 32-year wars today, but that's what we had back at the beginning. It involved 5 Muslim nations in the northern Africa, Middle Eastern region, and there are areas that are still problems for us today. Tripoli right here, this is where Libya is today. Algiers is not a nation anymore. Tunis is not Tunisia. But that region of North Africa is still a hotbed for Muslim terrorists, and Turkey is a problem as well. And so that was a problem back then. And it got to, by the time we got to Thomas Jefferson being president in 1801, the biggest line item we had in the federal budget was fighting Muslim terrorists. It was 15% of the federal budget, hands down, bigger than any item in the budget today. And it was back then, 15%. Nothing comes to 15%. Well, that's at that point, Jefferson said, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to eradicate these guys. And so what happened was he loaded up the Navy and the Marines under Commodore Edward Preble and under General William Eaton, and we went across North Africa. We went into those regions where the Muslim hotbeds were even back then. And Tripoli is particularly of interest because as a Marine, you know the Marine Corps hymn, the Marine flag and the Marine hymn, it says from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. And that's Muslim terrorists. We were fighting Muslim terrorists 200 years ago, and the Marine hymn says, look, we'll go wherever the enemy is. If it's Muslim terrorists in Tripoli or Montezuma, and you go through military history, it's pretty fun to see all that. But to the shores of Tripoli is really an acknowledgement of the 32 years that we fought Muslim terrorists. We had a whole bunch of guys killed there. That's a war where they didn't keep records. We know there were, I can't tell you how many countless people were in prison because the Muslims would take any American flag they saw on an American ship, capture it, either kill those guys on the ship or take them prisoners and sell them back as ransom, kind of like what the Somali pirates do now. So that was our second war. The third war, the War of 1812, was actually about 3 years. It's called the Second War for American Independence. The British were not keeping their word from what they had promised at the end of the American Revolution. They're back to doing the very same things they did that led us to the Revolution. Even though we're an independent nation, they're still getting involved in our affairs. They're taking American ships on the high seas. They're oppressing seamen. So we go to war over that. There's 3,300 POWs. There's 4,500 wounded, and there's 2,600 killed. Now, a lot of loss of life, but that's really what secured American independence was that war. That's what finally got the American Revolution to where it worked, was we got the British to back off after we whipped them twice. Again, notice the ratio there, twice as many wounded as there are killed. We'll talk about that later. The Mexican War is the next major war that happens. That war, 1946 to 1948. Zachary Taylor, that's where he became a big hero. He became president of the United States because of what he did, particularly in the Mexican War. 840 prisoners of war, 4,100 wounded, and 13,000 killed. And notice there, the ratio is about 3 to 1 of killed to wounded. So this is a war. People don't think about that many losses. And again, America is not a large nation back then. We didn't have any of the Western territory. It was a result of the Mexican War that Texas gets added, and then also the Western territories established across Arizona, New Mexico, and California. So a big war, Civil War, we've mentioned a little bit. This is where Decoration Day got started. But in that war, with all that went on, POWs, you had 431,000, and particularly in Confederate camps, the treatment of POWs is almost close to what happened with Nazi Germany with Jews. You can see the condition of these guys. There's none of these pictures coming out of Union camps because Confederate prisoners of war were not treated that way. But this is part of what went on. It was a barbaric time. You had 354,000 wounded. By the way, that is Clara Barton. She was the most famous nurse in the Civil War, and she's there with the wounded. And you had 620,000 killed. And again, the killed to the wounded is so much higher. So this is Civil War time. And by the way, that was a very coarsening time. America probably came close to being eliminated after that war, because after you've killed brother against brother, family member against family member, you've killed your own citizens, there's a coarsening of heart that takes place. And the thing that really changed that was General Lew Wallace, who was a general in the Civil War. Those of you that have come to the library at Wall Builders, you've seen the Ben-Hur. The novel Ben-Hur came out in 1880 at a time when America's morals were down, because it's just hard to live with having killed so many of your own fellow citizens. And so the book Ben-Hur brought people back to their faith. It's as a result of that we get into the turn of the century revivals that brings America back to its foundations. So it was a tough time, but it was something that led to a spiritual revival and brought America back. Then the Spanish-American War, you have all the brutality of what Spain was doing in Cuba. Then Spain started attacking Americans living in Cuba, taking the property of Americans and attacking Americans. So we start getting involved, and then the battleship Maine is sitting there in Havana in the harbor, and it blows up. And so we declare war, and that's what led to the famous stuff with Teddy Roosevelt. That's where he comes to fame, is with those Rough Riders. And so in that Spanish-American War, there's 1,600 that are wounded, and there's 2,400 that are killed in the Spanish-American War over that year that we fought that. Leads us to World War I. In World War I, we got involved from 1916 to 1918. The world was involved much earlier. We tried to stay out of it, but Woodrow Wilson finally got us into the war. And at that point in time, what happens over those 3 years is 4,100 POWs, you have 200,000 wounded, and you have 116,000 killed. Now notice for the first time, the wounded is higher than the killed. It's always been killed higher than wounded. So now we're seeing kind of a trend where that you start having more wounded than you have killed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So that's World War I. World War II, we are more familiar with this war. Of course, for America, it started with Pearl Harbor, what happened with the attack on December 7th, 1941. It was going before that for the rest of the world. Back in the late 30s, you got Hitler invading Czechoslovakia and Poland and elsewhere. But for America, we got drawn into it because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so there's 130,000 prisoners of war. Gary and Karen, you guys here? Right here. Is Rufus with you this morning? Rufus right there. Rufus Choate was one of the prisoners of war in World War II. He, I believe, was the last surviving member of the Lost Battalion, the famous battalion from Jacksboro, now lives in Abilene. He was part of the 36th Texas Infantry Division. He was in, I think, E Company. It was 131st Field Artillery. And the guys from this part of West Texas had been sent over, and their mission when they got there was to support our allies. One of the allies was the Dutch. And so we assigned that part of the Texas Infantry, our Texas Division, to help the Dutch and Dutch Java. And Rufus saw battle. So he was part of the support group for the bombers that were stationed there. Saw brutal battle, but the Dutch surrendered the island. And when they did, all the Americans became prisoners of war. And it's called the Lost Battalion because over 2 years, no one knew what happened to them. They had just been there for a couple of days, and then, a short period of time, not a couple of days, short period of time, and then nobody hears from them again. So Rufus was prisoner of war, I think, for 42 months, was taken to Japan, did slave labor in Japan. It was brutal. He went into that situation 155 pounds, came out of the prisoner of war camp at 98 pounds. Just rough stuff. Sir, thank you very much for your sacrifice. So 130,000 prisoners of war, 671,000 wounded, 405,000 killed. Again, the wounded is now higher than the killed, and that's because medicine is starting to make advances. Back in the American Revolution, if you got wounded, chances are you're going to die. If you just got shot in the shoulder, because it's going to get infected, we don't know how to stop the infections, we don't have any antibiotics. It was on D-Day that penicillin was first used. And so this is medicine moving forward, and that's why you'll see the numbers start changing. After World War II, we have the Korean War. It's often called the Forgotten War, and it really is. It was a very brutal condition. The winter conditions in Korea were just pretty unbelievable for those who went through it. It's a forgotten war. Korean veterans, as most veterans, don't talk about it all that much. But 8,200 POW, not high POW because the Chinese, the North Koreans, were very barbaric. They'd kill you rather than make you a prisoner of war. 103,000 wounded. 36,000 killed in the Korean War. You move into and by the way, this is Americans buried in Korea that never got brought home from Korea. This is a Korean military cemetery with Americans there. You get into the Vietnam War. Vietnam War, we started putting advisors in 64. We got out in 75. Over that period of time, with all the Americans that served, only 766 POWs. And again, that's because the Viet Cong were so barbaric. They would absolutely kill you rather than save you. And so very few. One is Congressman Sam Johnson, he was Top Gun. He's a good friend. He's just a great guy. But we have several Texans who were among that 766. You have 304,000 wounded, and you have 58,000 killed. Notice the numbers are even higher with the ratio of wounded to killed now. Medicine's making huge advances. Brings us to the Persian Gulf War. Persian Gulf War, 1991. 23 were prisoners of war, 467 were wounded, and 382 were killed. It's one of the shorter wars we've had. It was very decisive. America went in, put our foot down, ended the nonsense in a fairly short period of time as far as wars go. And that brings us to the War on Terror, which started with 9/11. It had been going actually before that for a number of years. The number of terrorist attacks against us had been there for a long time. But finally, that kind of pushed us over the edge, said we're tired of all the sniping that the terrorists are doing, just picking off a few here or there in this embassy and that embassy, and the bombing of the Trade Center the first time. We're going to put an end to it. And so as a result of what happened, and Pentagon here, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, Colonel Birdwell was right there with that pile of rubble all around him. But 2001, we launched the attack into the terrorist regions. We go after Taliban, etc. From then up to now, 17 years, we've had 50,000 wounded. We have had in that period of time 7,000 killed. And again, notice the ratio now is 7-to-1 wounded killed. And that's because the medical professions moved so far ahead that now they can take those serious wounds, and it's no longer a death sentence as it had been. So that's part of the change that happened over that period of time. But that's what leads to the 1.2 million. And of course, there's more. We didn't cover the Indian Wars. That's why Fort Richardson exists, because the Indian Wars, about 30 years of really brutal conflict there. There's a lot of other wars in our history, but these are the big ones. And this is pretty much what's not in textbooks anymore, what's not in the standards anymore. But that's why we have Memorial Day, to remember that what we have costs somebody else to give us what we enjoy today and what we take for granted today. So we give honor to those to whom honor is due. That's what we do on Veterans Day with military guys in general, but on Memorial Day specifically with those who paid the ultimate price. And I mentioned earlier about Colonel Birdwell. Colonel Birdwell is now a Texas state senator. He serves here in Texas. He was lieutenant colonel stationed at the Pentagon at the time that 9/11 hit. When 9/11 hit, he will show you more about it later. He'll describe this picture to you. But that's where his office was. The part that collapsed, this was his office here. He was standing behind that window when the plane hit. So he gets covered with the jet fuel. As a result, he spends huge time, and I'm sorry, the pictures are fairly graphic, but you need to see. This is what guys go through, including Brian, who's sitting here with us. He was burned over 60% of his body, 30% of his body. Third-degree burns means he had no skin at all on 30% of his body. And that's what he faced. And so as he starts recovering, you can see all the skin grafts all over him, bad shape. He's been through, I think, like 50 surgeries at this point, but he's here with us. But as Paul said, I bear on my body the marks of the Lord Jesus Christ. He bears in his body the marks of having defended the nation. And so that's part of what he has literally. This is shortly after he's able to get out of the hospital, still has a lot of surgeries to go. My kids saw it for the first time. They said, "That's cool. The Army lets their guys wear headbands?" Not quite. That's to hold the skin grafts on his forehead where all the skin had been burned off. He's wearing very tight gloves. The gloves hold the skin grafts on his hands where it was burned. He has bands wrapped around his arms. So it's letting the skin grow back. But he's a Texan, has been all the way. As a matter of fact, County Commissioner Birdwell here in Jack County, that's one of Brian's family members, and so the Birdwell family known here in the county, and that's his wife Mel. That's his adult supervision that he keeps with him all the time. As we all know as guys, that's our adult supervision. But Lieutenant Colonel Brian Birdwell. Brian, come on, bro.
You don't ever want to give applause to a military guy that will stand up here and tell you I got my Purple Heart for coming out of the men's restroom.
Is your mic? Check your mic, Bri.
That's 1, 2, 3. There we go. All right. It is a treat to join you. I came for two reasons. You heard David talk a little bit about family. Yesterday I was over in Graham. I'd been planning on it for quite some time, but all my family are buried in the two cemeteries over in Graham. Dad was born in Bryson. I've had many a Hertzberger long before it moved over there on north heading toward Wichita Falls, but when it used to be a shack in the 60s and early 70s. We're going to eat at Dairyland, I think, afterwards. I've gone through that drive-through many times with Dad. The primary reason, though, I came to Jack County isn't just the familial connection, is out of fear of David Barton. David did not call me and invite me. He called me and cordially demanded me to come today and visit with y'all. It is appropriate that I get to share with you some of the great story of the Lord's grace from September 11th. When I was going through went to the Birdwell side of the cemetery visits yesterday. I don't want to say I'm enamored, but it's neat as a point of history. Very much what David just did in covering history, to look at headstones or foot markers, and most that I saw were World War II, some World War I. In fact, my mom's father, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, served in World War I, but the headstone doesn't, his marker does not designate him as a veteran, even though he served in the early Air Forces or the Army Air Corps in World War I in 1918. But since the headstone doesn't say that or give any indication, there was not a flag there. So I went to Walmart over in Graham and put one in there. And for my other grandfather, my paternal grandfather, I did the same thing because his doesn't have an indication of him being a veteran, even though he was a World War I veteran as well. Those headstones tell you quite the story. In fact, there was one I did see, like David had said, I did see one headstone from the Spanish-American War. And if you go to Gettysburg, went to Gettysburg many years ago, 8-9 years ago, and was a friend of ours during Law Enforcement Memorial Day. I am having, should I just use my colonel's voice? Okay. I can just stand up here and yell at everybody, so, you know. It's all right. We'll trade weapon systems here. Yes, sir. I am still. Test 1, 2, 3. Test. All right. I'm still an old single action guy. For me, technology is no more complicated. It better not be any more complicated than pull hammer, pull trigger. Today's cell phones are a Christmas tree with way too many ornaments on them, if you know what I mean. There we go. And I'll just stick this in my pocket here. All right. There was one headstone marker from the Spanish-American War. But when I was at Gettysburg, all of those headstones or markers are generally by state. None of the Confederate soldiers are buried there at Gettysburg. But you have Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. They're buried by regiment. But there have been additional burials at Gettysburg because it, like Arlington and all of our veteran cemeteries, as long as there is space, continue active burials. When I was there, I saw 2 headstones of gentlemen that had served, and their date of death was December 7th, 1941. So when you go look at headstones and you see those flags and you think about the history that those folks have lived, let me tell you a little bit of history of what happened on the morning of September 11th. I was serving as the military aide to the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Installation Management. I'm on the Army staff in a bureaucratic fighting position Of course, that military aide to the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Installation Management is a nice big title for Chief Donut Getter, because lieutenant colonels in the Pentagon are nothing more than galley slaves. If you remember the movie Ben-Hur David referenced, go watch the scene where Charlton Heston is chained to his oar and the Roman admiral comes in. That 16 seconds of dialogue is about what it's like in the Pentagon. We keep you alive to serve this ship, row well and live. That's what life is like as a lieutenant colonel inside the Pentagon. That morning, our staff directorate, which functioned as the Army's city manager staff directorate, for lack of a better description, everything that dealt with Army installations as their own cities is what we dealt with. General Van Antwerp, Miss Menig, Colonel Williams, who was General Van Antwerp's aide. I was Miss Menig's aide, but Colonel Williams took the two of them over to the Doubletree because of the conference that we were hosting that morning, and Sandy and Cheryl and I settled in for what we expected to be a slow day. That morning at about 8:55, 9 o'clock, Sandy gets a call from her daughter Sam up in New York. Says, "Hey Mom, turn the TV on, the World Trade Center has been hit by a plane." And we did in that building what all of you here in Jack County or wherever you were that morning did, whether it was listening to the radio in your car, TV at home, TV at work, whatever the manner in which you were being notified of the events that were unfolding. Sandy, Cheryl, and I stepped into Miss Menig's office, turned on the TV, and were watching the footage and saw the North Tower, the first tower hit with the antenna mast. And watching that, seeing the blue sky, weather was not a factor, and you see the one of the two largest office buildings had been hit squarely by the aircraft, and there's just that little voice in the back of our minds that as the news commentators are talking what appears to be a tragic accident, and that little voice just telling us this doesn't smell right. And that would be confirmed in short order at about 9:10, 9:15, Flight 175, as we're watching the events unfold up in New York. We watch on live TV the second plane crash into the South Tower at nearly 600 miles an hour, and that would confirm that little voice that this was not a normal day in our nation's life, and these are not accidents, but this is very deliberate. Sandy and Cheryl and I, we knelt down and just said that prayer, okay, Lord, we love our first responders, but it's going to be you doing the bulk of the life-saving today. There was no thought that we at the Pentagon were next. It was very quiet, not just because of our principal and deputy being out of the building, but there weren't any phone calls coming in. It was just very quiet as we were watching the events unfold. I had my morning Coke that morning at about 7 o'clock, that jolt of caffeine that all of us need first thing in the morning to be at ramming speed for the bulk of the day. And so at 9:35, I told Sandy and Cheryl I would step out and I was going to go to the men's restroom and that I would be back momentarily. And those are the last words that I would speak to my two coworkers. I stepped out, went to the men's restroom, took care of business, came out of the men's restroom, and at 9:37, Flight 77 is deliberately crashed into the Pentagon at the intersection of the fourth quarter and the E-ring at first and second floor level. And so that you understand what a miracle it is that I'm still here with you today and that the Lord still answers prayers. Do you want me to forward the slides myself here? Let's see. There we go. All right, good deal. Now, the most dangerous thing on the battlefield is the United States soldier. The most dangerous thing in the Pentagon is a lieutenant colonel with a laser pointer. So I'm going to make sure that my gunnery skills here are right. So let me orient you real quickly, if I may. Pentagon, being the world's largest office building, is a large area. But the A-ring is the innermost ring of the Pentagon that surrounds the 4 to 5 acres of courtyard. The E-ring is the outermost ring of the Pentagon. And of course you have 5 rings. You have the A, B, C, and D rings, and the E. And then the spokes that connect them are the quarters. This is quarter 4, quarter 5, quarter 6. The intersection of the quarter 5 and quarter 6 at the A ring will play a key role in location in the story I'm about to tell you. Flight 77 makes penetration at the intersection of the fourth quarter and the E-ring at first and second floor level. It does not come in completely level, but slightly canted to the left of the 4 piloting hijackers. And I do not mean to describe this to you and give any credence or skill or set or compliment to the piloting hijacker of Flight 77. But of the 4 piloting hijackers, Hani Hanjour was the piloting hijacker of Flight 77. Already had a commercial pilot's license. He had never flown anything as large as a 757. But he already had the skill set necessary to be able to attack the Pentagon, which is why we believe that he was assigned to attack the Pentagon. When the plane makes penetration at the intersection of the 4th quarter and the E-ring, it makes penetration through the E, D, and C ring. And so similar to when you take a long sleeve shirt off, and when you take the shirt off, you turn the sleeve inside out as you take that shirt off. That's how the plane makes penetration through the building. The nose of the fuselage makes impact with the outer wall of the building, begins to peel like a banana, that when you first peel a banana back, and then the tail makes deepest penetration. So the plane turns inside out as it's passing through the building, and so that over here between the C and the B rings, between those 2 rings, there's a service road called A&E Drive, is where the black box recorders are recovered for Flight 77. So the plane turns inside out, killing 125 of your fellow Americans in the building and 59 on the aircraft, not including or memorializing the terrorists. This also gives you a picture of where the helipad is. This is, you got some of the first responder vehicles, recovery vehicles that are parked here on the helipad. But that is how Mel knows that that's my side of the building. You can see the air traffic control tower here and the helipad here. Mel does not know which window is mine, but as the media is covering the crash at the Pentagon, when she sees the helipad as well as the air traffic control tower, she knows that my side of the building has been impacted. Again, this picture David originally showed you, I've put the graphics on it. The X shows you where the nose of the fuselage makes impact with the building. You can see a little bit of the arc here of the fuselage. The left engine makes penetration at first floor level, where you see the dashed circle here. And in fact, you can see where the left wing, when it makes impact, damages the limestone at first floor level, but the left engine passes through here. The vertical line is the expansion joint. That's the architectural feature that allows the building to contract and expand with the seasons. It's where the seam is of the building to be able to allow those expansions. Well, everything to the right of that vertical line is what will collapse 27 minutes later. This solid line is a solid circle is my window where my desk was located. This window is where Miss Minig's office was, because I sat right outside of her office, and that's where Sandy and Cheryl and I were watching events unfold up in New York. And 2 to 3 days after the attack and the fires put out is where their remains would be recovered. This picture by Officer Garcia, again of the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, the Pentagon's police department, this time just a few moments before collapse of that portion of the Pentagon. You see the large center impact hole has gotten larger as the building has been structurally compromised over that 27 minutes as the building's burning. Pieces are crumbling, falling. The center hole is getting larger. The window that I'm in fact behind is just off the screen here at time of impact. So let me give you just a quick diagram of it. This is Miss Minig's window here. These 4 dots are one of the temporary light stands. You can see the pole that are shining the light on the building at night. But that is her window right behind those 4 dotted areas. This is the window I'm in fact behind at time of impact. This slide was put together by Deputy Attorney General McNulty in the prosecution of Zacharias Moussaoui. Doesn't seem like I can say this, but 13 years ago. It shows a complete outer facade of the E-ring at the crash site. It shows you the left side that did not collapse and the right side that did not collapse, with the center portion that will collapse. The 3 sections were melded together to give you the complete outer view of the E-ring and the Pentagon. And then Flight 77, the artist rendering of it passing into the building or making impact with the building at about a 45-degree angle, first and second floor level. The window that is circled to the left of the fuselage is my window that my desk was located. And then this is the window that I was actually behind at time of impact. So in fact, when I step out to go to the men's restroom, I step out into the E-ring hallway, and you can see the center portion of each ring is where the hallways are. So you have office on the left side, office on the right side. The left side, you have a window view of parts of Washington, D.C. On the inside of the ring, all you can see is the next ring over. But when I step out into the E-ring hallway, I walk through what would be the impact point and the crash site, get up to the fourth quarter. You can see the top of the fourth quarter here. Turn left to go to the men's restroom, which is next to the elevators. This is the top of the elevator shaft. I went to the men's restroom, came out. I'm walking back toward the E-ring, and I'm about to turn right back into the E-ring hallway to return to my office. So I'm about 5 to 7 yards behind this window at the time of impact. By the Lord's grace, I am the only survivor in the E-ring at the crash site. And it is from these pictures that you should very clearly take. The Army did not make me the toughest guy in that building. I did not survive a 757 making impact with the building and where I'm located from here to that door because the Army made me the toughest guy. I survived it because the toughest man in human form to ever walk this earth 2,000 years ago, who sits at the right hand of the Father, is the reason I'm alive today. This was not like one of Governor Schwarzenegger's action-adventure movies where you see the flame coming down the hallway and you make a reasoned, rational decision. In fact, as a kid growing up in Fort Worth, I know many of you will, probably very familiar with Fort Worth when Carswell Air Force Base used to be a B-52 Strategic Air Command base. And if you were sitting in the Ridgemar parking lot when one of those things was taken off, it sounded like the world was coming to an end. As an artilleryman for 10 years of my 20-year career, I've been around a lot of loud things in my life. Nothing as loud as that plane making impact with the building. I heard the sound, thought bomb, and in the next nanosecond, I am tossed around like a rag doll inside that hallway with the shock, the violence, the concussion, and the vacuum doing all kinds of damage to my body, and I'm set ablaze. There are a number of pains and emotions that I will experience, some physical, some emotional. The first pain I'll experience is the physical pain of the burns. I was burned on 60% of my body, with 40% of my body being third-degree burns. My arms from fingertip to armpit. I generally don't show the graphic nature. I mean, there are times I will, but it's generally not something I'll do. But I'm not ashamed of it, and I'm not disappointed with David or anything like that in showing the pictures. Those are hard to look at because that's after I've cleaned up and the maggots have done what they've done. I'm now ready to be grafted. But I was burned on 60% with 40% of my body third degree. My arms from fingertip to armpit on both arms are completely grafted. I was burned, circumferentially, grafted circumferentially. When my hands were burned, the webbing, particularly between the thumb and the index finger, was burned away. And the thumb is actually, for lack of a better term, melted to the palm. Dr. Jordan had to go into both hands, make an incision, pull the thumb bone out, give me a graft inside to give me something of an opposing thumb so that I now have the ability to grip things. The fingers had to be divided. My eye sockets were rebuilt. I had keloids and other things in the neck area. My ears are artificial cartilage with my own skin grafted over it. Guys, you got no idea what it's like to be the only man sitting in a plastic surgeon's waiting room. Think about that for a moment. I'll let you. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to laugh. Lord's got a sense of humor, okay? I wasn't finding it in that moment, but the most immediate life-threatening injury, though, is not the exterior burns. It's the inhalation injury that I'm sustaining. Jet A is the primary fuel for commercial aircraft. And any petroleum-based product, when burned inefficiently, is very slick, oily, combustion fire. I am set ablaze, but what I'm also breathing in is I went from a well-lit hallway, fully aware of my faculties and my surroundings, to an earthly hell of fire and that choking black smoke. I went from a 70-degree hallway to somewhere between 300 and 350 in just a moment. And I'm breathing in not just the temperature of what I'm breathing in, but the acrid fuel, petroleum-based, slick, aerosolized jet fuel that I'm breathing in. And the lungs do the same thing that the exterior of the body does. When you touch that hot stove and the blister begins to form, and the liquid begins to form inside the blister, that's what's happening to the lungs. So while I'm burning rapidly on the outside, on the inside I am very slowly beginning the process of drowning with the liquid that is forming into my lungs. I do what the Lord created every one of us in the womb when He knitted us in our mother's womb, that desire for life, that survival instinct, that zest for living. I struggled to get to my feet, and all I can see as my facial hair's burned, hair's burned. I mean, you saw the graphic pictures. I don't need to paint that picture for you anymore. But I struggled to get to my feet, and because of the vacuum and the concussion, the sense of balance in my ears and my cochlea was massively destroyed. I could get to all fours, but in trying to get up to try to struggle to safety, there was no way to do that. And in fact, and while kids, those of you that are out there, stop, drop, and roll absolutely is the right advice, but there is no sprinkler system and no first actions that were going to save me. I mean, stop, drop, and roll was irrelevant because all I can see in the periphery of my vision is just blackness, and in the immediate front of me a yellow-orangish glow and haze of the fire that is around me and the fire that is consuming me. I struggle to get to my feet, and I can't. And there comes that moment that seemed to take an eternity to get there, but it was no more than a minute. It's certainly less than 2, but I came to that moment where I'm struggling to survive, that zest for living, that desire to live, but there's no way to know which way is to danger, which way is to safety, because I'm completely disoriented inside that building. That I come to that moment, that line in the ground, that imaginary line, that threshold that's like, I'm struggling to survive, and I eventually get to that point where I do what we in the military never trains us to do, and that's surrender and quit. And it's truly the definition of the word terrorism, the nature of what I've just described to you, the gravity. There's just no words in the English language to give you the gravity of the emotion that I have just described to you, what it's like to go from the desire to live to stepping over that line as you're burning and saying, okay, Lord, I got it. This is a horrible, ghastly way to be called into eternity. And in that moment, I recognized that my life was being extinguished and that I'd accepted that reality, and I collapsed to the floor, and I did what we in the military are never trained to do, and that's quit. I surrendered. I collapsed to the floor, waited to die. And in that moment, there's no way to give you the same peace, the words that would describe the same peace and silence and quiet of the faith and confidence of where you're going to spend eternity. And as I lay there waiting to hear those words, well done, thou good and faithful servant, this is where I was not discovering the Lord's sense of humor, but He certainly has one. And that's, I didn't get the good and faithful servant part, but I did get the well done part. It's okay. You can laugh. I mean, so now, this will give you an idea of what a sick man David Barton is, okay? I only know that joke because David's the one that told it to me at a Kentucky Fried Chicken in Virginia Beach many years ago. We were standing there. We'd just spoken at some church, and I went in and the guy, the wait staff there at the KFC said, do you want that original recipe or extra crispy? And David looks at me like, that probably means something very different to you now, doesn't it? And I'm like, you're sick, man, So, but there's a number of miracles that would bring me out of that circumstance, and I don't have the time with you today to share all of them because there's some more important things to tell you about and describe to you. But I'll eventually be able to get up because the sprinkler system had engaged, extinguished the flames that were consuming me, but not the flames that were still very close to me and in danger. I staggered down that fourth quarter hallway, and the front of my shirt is still intact but covered in blood. but my name tag and my access badge are melted but still connected to the shirt. My leather belt and only the very small front portion of my pants is still intact. The back side of me has been burned away as I lay there waiting to die, and I'm burning. So the shirt, the t-shirt, the pants, only the leather belt and my leather shoes are the only complete piece of clothing still on me. As I stagger down the hallway with my hands up against the wall, working my way toward the A ring, that innermost ring of the building, I'm coming out of the smoke. While the smoke is filling up the ceiling, it's getting a little bit lighter as I'm working my way down the hallway toward where the lights are still on. And I can see the damage done to my body. I can also feel my eyes swelling shut. I know I need to get to medical care as fast as I can. And 4 men, Bill McKinnon, Roy Wallace, John Davies, and Chuck Knobloch, come out of the B ring door into the 4th quarter. And Roy Wallace is the first person to me. And in my exhaustion of having covered 20, 30 yards in the condition that I just described, of being a charbroiled American that's walking down that hallway, I come across Roy, and in my relief of knowing that I'm now about to subordinate myself to whatever my comrades in arms decide they're going to do for me, and also the exhaustion of covering 20 to 30 yards in that condition, I collapsed in front of Roy. Bill McKinnon I knew. Bill and I had been classmates together at Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Let me say that again. Classmates at Leavenworth, not cellmates at Leavenworth. Classmates at Leavenworth. But I recognize Bill, but Bill doesn't recognize me. And this is not a place to tarry. This is like the crash is right there. I've staggered down to the back into the sanctuary, about to go into the foyer, and that's where I come across Bill, Roy, Chuck, and John. Collapse in front of them. This is not a place where they can sit with me and wait for medical care to get to me. In fact, the fire door between the A and the B ring is already closed. The building managers have sealed the fire off. Had Bill, Roy, Chuck, and John not come out into that hallway, I would eventually gotten to that door, sat down, and either one, died of my injuries, died of smoke inhalation, or maybe a fireman will get to me to open that door. Bill, Roy, Chuck, and John don't leave me there to stay, and don't sit there and stay with me. They know because they've got to move me. They each grab a limb in their haste to pick me up, and they give that grip on my arms and my legs, and they give that first exertion to pick me up, and I don't come with them. They pull chunks of flesh off of me because with burns, the body's been dehydrated. The water in your body that actually holds you together has been evaporated. And it's my first insight into the pain thresholds that are ahead of me, and I begin screaming at them to leave me alone. But they don't leave me there. Chuck is the biggest of the 4. Chuck rolls me over the left-hand side, and touching me is absolutely agonizing. And Chuck forcibly puts his arms under the left side of my back, the left side of the torso, taking chunks off my back, and as I'm still yelling at them, and essentially Bill, Roy, Chuck, and John, instead of grasping me, have their arms underneath my body, grasping each other's hands, so that they're gripping each other with my body weight resting on their connected arms. And they carry me through the B ring door into an A ring access door to eventually what I showed you in the slide, the intersection of the 5th and 6th quarters, where it intersects at the A ring, where I'll receive my first medical care from a great Air Force doctor named John Baxter. And Dr. Baxter will treat me very quickly, and he'll treat me first of the 5 or 6 of us that have been placed there in what became essentially a hasty triage site. Dr. Baxter was heading to the medical clinic. He was an Air Force flight surgeon, so he was not practicing. He was not in a practice medicine billet. He was in a flight surgeon's staff billet, but he had his go bag with him. I'm the first one he treats, and that tells me that I'm the most seriously injured of those here. Dr. Baxter will ask me my name, and then he will take my shoes off, because the only place that he can see non-charred and non-damaged flesh is my uninjured feet that are underneath the leather that was protecting my feet. He takes the shoe off, what's left of the sock underneath the leather, and puts the morphine into my right foot in the top of the veins in the top of the foot, and he puts an IV into the left to put liquids into me. A wonderful lady from the Navy, Natalie Ogletree, will come to the right-hand side. We'll say the Lord's Prayer together, the 23rd Psalm together. She'll read the 91st Psalm over me. And I still have my mental faculties about me, but I am trembling violently, and I'm not able to control my physical faculties. I'll be loaded on a bodyboard, put on the extended, essentially golf cart that is the ambulances in the Pentagon. And all this is happening faster than I can imagine. Even though I know it took longer than what it really did, it's happening. My death inside the hallway was enormously slow. But now my evacuation out of the building seems to be happening faster than it really is. I'll be taken to Georgetown University, and this is the Lord's sovereignty in this whole process. There were a number of hospitals that received casualties that day. Arlington, Inova, Fairfax, various others. Eventually, one would be taken to Walter Reed, but I was the only casualty taken to Georgetown across the Potomac River from the Pentagon through Rosslyn and over into Georgetown area of D.C. And that's God's prescient hand in my survival. The attending physician at Georgetown is Dr. Michael Williams, and Georgetown is a teaching hospital, and he spent 2 years in a trauma fellowship learning to be and certified to be a teaching emergency room doctor. And that teaching would occur at the Washington Hospital Center under the direction of Marion Jordan and James Jang. Dr. Jordan at the time is the director of the Burn Center, the regional burn unit in the Washington Hospital Center, and he's also the president of the American Burn Association, the association of all the different burn docs that are scattered around not just the United States but around the world in many foreign countries. So from the perspective of emergency room care and all the great docs that I had, or the doctors that are in emergency rooms, I have the third best burn doctor available to me in Dr. Williams. Because normally in an emergency room, it's airway, breathing, circulation. Once those three things are stabilized, you're evacuated to specialized care. But because of the nature of the weapon systems used on September 11th, when Flight 77 makes penetration of the Pentagon, shortly after that, Vice President Cheney, inside the White House Situation Room, will direct Secretary of Transportation Mineta to shut down all airspace in the United States. No medevac helicopters are flying. So I'll remain at Georgetown for nearly 5 hours. And in that 5-hour time frame, Dr. Williams will do with me or to me the very brutal things that have to be done to the burn survivor. Because as bad as the injury is, what has to be done to you medically is far worse. There are a number of things that I will endure. I'm getting a little emotional here, and I want to bring my train of thought. I'm going to bring the caboose up here on my train of thought here in just a moment. There are really hard things that I was physically enduring. But I want to describe to you what was the most emotionally difficult thing. That night, about 2 in the morning, it's actually September 12th, about 2 in the morning, Mel's story is just as amazing. She gets to the Washington Hospital Center, and again, I don't have time to share all of it with you. But Mel gets to Georgetown just a few minutes before they're going to move me to the Washington Hospital Center. The Georgetown Police Department drive her through the empty streets of Washington, D.C. to get to the Washington Hospital Center. Ladies and gentlemen, the last time the capital of the United States was that empty and that evacuated because of an act of war in the national capital region, Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States. That gives you an indication of the nature of the enemy that we face in radical Islamic terrorism. Mel gets to Georgetown, then she gets to the Washington Hospital Center. I have no idea she's there. But about 2 in the morning, the Surgeon General of the Army arrives at the Washington Hospital Center because the Army's trying to get a handle on all the casualties, where they are, who's where, and who's missing. And the burn survivors are the ones that are in the most critical physical condition. General Peake, who is the Surgeon General, will come in and ask Mel if we can come in and visit me together. Mel's standing on one side of me, General Peake's on the other. General Peake will say, "Has Matt been up here to see his father?" Mel says, "No, not yet." And General Peake would be very wise in the words he uses And he tells Mel, you need to get Matt up here to see his father as quickly as you can. And Mel would process not just what General Peake was saying, but what he was saying, but how he didn't say it. And that is, your husband's dying. And you need to get his son up here to say goodbye before he passes. And Matt would make that visit. And I remember it, not clearly, but I remember it emotionally. What it was like to lay there wrapped like a mummy with a tube in every orifice of my body, pleading for the Lord to finish what the terrorists had started. And I see my son walk in through the slits in my eyes that I can still see through. And I can see the tears in his eyes as he comes to the right-hand side. He says, I love you, Dad. And all I can do is just mouth back to him because I cannot speak. I've got a trach in my throat. A respirator's doing the breathing for me. All I can do is just mouth. And I would tell him, I love you too, son. You've asked me to do a lot of hard things. Most of these ribbons, the miniatures that I'm wearing, are a representation of all the different countries I've been into for you and on your behalf, where a porta-john is a major home improvement. And I'd do it all again. But the hardest thing you've ever asked me to do is say goodbye to my son. I cannot imagine how hard it was for Christ to hang on that cross, and when Christ says it is finished, for the Father to say goodbye to the Son. Because with my death, I would have been joined with Christ. With Christ's death, He goes to defeat the gates of hell. There's other comparisons that they are not parallel in their equality, but they are parallel in their senior subordinate that I want to share with you, because what I just described for you is the human experience that Christ had. I want to give you the spiritual experience that Christ had. And I'll just start with the very basics. On October 26th, General Shinseki, the Chief of Staff of the Army, came to my hospital room and pinned the Purple Heart on my pillow. My nation, on behalf of you as American citizens, my nation was championing me with, it's not the most coveted medal because nobody wants to get it because of the price associated with it. You get it because somebody else gives it to you, called an enemy. But my nation was championing me with that Purple Heart and saying thank you. Christ, on the other hand, in Mark 15, is being adored with a purple robe to be mocked and ridiculed as the King of the Jews. There's other areas as well. President Bush is brought to the Washington Hospital Center on the morning of September 13th. There are 7 of us in the burn ICU. 2 of us are uniformed service members. Navy Lieutenant Schaefer and Lieutenant Colonel Birdwell are in ICU. Major Dave King, who's a 30% burn, which would qualify for ICU, but because they don't have that many beds, they treat him as if he's ICU down in step down. There are 3 of us that are uniformed. The others are Department of the Army or Department of Navy civilians. President Bush comes into my room, renders the salute, and again, I don't have the entirety of the time, but I try to return that salute, and the President's looking at similar to what you saw as he's receiving that salute, because I'm prepared for surgery, so I'm not wrapped up in bandages. I simply have sterile towels covering me for the speed of transition to the surgery and the tank, which is the scrubbing that occurs to you in a burn unit. The President holds this salute for me. I drop my salute. He comes to the right-hand side and says, Colonel Birdwell, we're not going to suffer the injustice of the culture of terrorism anymore. Exactly what David described. We were no longer going to treat terrorism as a criminal activity. We're going to treat it as an act of war. The bottom line is this. The President of the United States was brought to me, and seeing the injustice of my injuries, said that He would bring justice to our enemies. Christ, on the other hand, with the false accusations of the Sanhedrin, is taken to Pontius Pilate. And Pilate, recognizing in Scripture the injustice and the falseness of the charges, sees an innocent man before him, but uses the authority given to him as the Roman procurator of Judea to send an innocent man to a cross and die the most ghastly of deaths you can die. The suffering that I endured when you're being scrubbed in bleach with no skin on your body, and on 5 occasions I had no anesthesia. I assure you, waterboarding is romper room compared to what's happening. Only the Lord could hear me scream because of the trach that's in my throat. But the doctors that were doing that to me were doing it for my survival. Whether it was the flogging, the nails, the hanging on the cross, the suffering that Christ would endure. I wear the scars of the suffering that I'd endured. But they're only scars that recognize the suffering for your freedom as a nation. In Scripture, Thomas will ask Christ, I won't believe unless I see the scars. And that is on Christ's glorified body. Someday, I will have my glorified body. You will not see these scars on my glorified body in eternity. As you see them now, they are a reminder of the price of freedom in living on the earth today in this great and greatest of nations. But when we get to eternity, as a reminder of the price paid for that eternal freedom, we'll see Christ's scars on His glorified body. And I'll close with this final comparison, because I started with talking about headstones over in Graham. Someday, I'll be interred, whether it's at Arlington or the State Cemetery in Austin. My name will be engraved on a headstone. My wife will eventually be buried with me, and it'll say all the things that we experienced, the dates, the medals, all the various things that come with rendering honors like we are doing today to veterans that have paid that full measure and are now interred for Memorial Day. But my death, had it happened September 11th, means absolutely zero to your eternity. Christ's death on that cross means that your name, you have the ability to make sure your name is placed in a more far important place than a headstone at Arlington National Cemetery, but a book called the Lamb's Book of Life. And it is for those reasons that Christ, while He's not spoken of as a veteran, in Revelation 19 He is spoken of as the commander of the armies of heaven. And that's why Jesus Christ is the greatest veteran of all time, and why those who have their headstones marked today and tomorrow are the most Christ-like among our nation. God bless you. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Pastor, if you'd please come. We'll get you. Thank you, sir.
To those who received Him, to them He gave the right, the authority, the power to become sons. As He shares His story, and as I told you at the very beginning, this is going to be the year of God's undeniable glory. That is God's undeniable glory. His manifested presence, His manifested power, and His manifested goodness. Only the goodness of God has allowed Him to be here today. Have you ever come to that place in your life that you've truly trusted Christ, that you've received Him? If not, I would be amiss to not give you that opportunity. Pray this simple prayer with me. Say, Father, as I listen today, as Brian gave the analogy of Christ giving His life, I want to do that. I want to receive Jesus as my Savior, as my Lord, my deliverer, my healer, my provider. I receive Him now. I thank You for the forgiveness of all my sin. In Jesus' name. Amen. That's a very simple process that takes place. And that's the analogy as I listened to Brian as he's sharing those things. But he always brought it back. Even though all he went through, he still sees that Jesus went through so much more. And that's the only reason that we're here, because He allows us to be here. Amen.
Thanks again for watching CMTV. We hope you enjoyed this week's message. If you would like to give a love offering or partner with us financially, visit cmjacksboro.com/give. Thanks again for watching, and welcome home.